The trials of Swaraj. I have to admit, I was as confused by the topic as many of you no doubt are as well. Excuse me. This is really a story of an idea. The term Swaraj comes from the Sanskrit swa, meaning self, and Raj, rule. And no doubt it's an unfamiliar term, but this is also then a story of discovery. Now, ideas do not occur in a vacuum. I'd like to share some of the background of this idea, this term, Swaraj, self-rule, and then talk about some of its applications, a little bit about its history, and try to make some theosophical connections between the ideas and some of the applications in the world. And finally, circle back to kind of a summary of this rather unusual idea. The background of India is really important to know. Perhaps most of us know that in the 19th century, Britain was a worldwide cultural dominant figure or country. The battles between science, religion, spiritualism were going on. Ideas were changing. And there wasn't a lot going on in the Western world. And part of that was the formation of the Theosophical Society as an application or as an extension of that broader theosophical movement. But in the East, there was also a lot going on, a lot of awakening, a lot of unrest. The Western world had dominated the East and was continuing to do so at a dramatic pace. And so India was ripe for new ideas, even though it was the home for an ancient culture, in fact, many ancient cultures and religions. And so into this mix of cultures, this contrast of cultural domination and awakening in the East, we have a new political and social and community reawakening of the sense of place and that was rapidly actually being lost in India. So to put the trials of Swaraj in some kind of a perspective, I came up with kind of an outline. It's neither complete nor authoritative, and it's no doubt very arbitrary and simplistic, but it's a place we can begin. The issue is with human beings when we are placed under stress, when we find that the world is not as just as it ought to be, really reacts in three different ways. The first, of course, is often political.
Wes, are you going to share your slides or?
Yes. This is, again, the trials of Swaraj. This is kind of an arbitrary, sort of simplistic way to look at Swaraj. I thought of it as political, social, and individual. The trial of dependence is kind of the difficulty that human beings find themselves in when governments and society and cultures are oppressive. The immediate and often natural, one might say, tendency is to want to rebel, to throw the bums out, to find an alternative means of government or something. The trial of independence is finding a basis for a healthy human interaction. Individuals need to find ways to cooperate and become self-sufficient. And then the third trial of interdependence is when a few individuals understand that their own development is predicated on helping everyone else. Everyone is his or her own ruler, and this begins a transformation of both the political and social environments. Again, this is just a rough outline, but I thought it might be helpful to think of it in terms of this kind of subject and the early history of the term Swaraj. Next slide, please, Ruth. I believe in a religion based on universal and all-embracing principles, which has always been accepted as true by mankind, and will continue to command the allegiance of mankind in the ages to come. This was said by Dayanand Saraswati. He was the founder of the Arya Samaj in India. It was an organization founded the same year, 1875, as the Theosophical Society. He was the first to use the term Swaraj, meaning self-rule. He was an ascetic Hindu that had to run away twice to escape a child marriage. He spent 25 years as a wandering yogi and formed this noble society, as he called it, in order to reform Hinduism. He saw the Vedas as the ultimate source of truth. And let's go to the next slide, if you would, please. And when the Theosophists ran across his ideas, they were quite taken by them. Colonel Olcott first corresponded by mail with some of Saraswati's associates in India and was really quite taken by the universality and depth of the Swami's thinking and his writing. So Blavatsky, in an article called "This Arya Samaj" in June of 1878, writes, "The Theosophical Society means, if it cannot rescue Christians from modern Christianity, at least to aid in saving the heathen from its influence. It is now an organized affiliation with the Arya Samaj of India, its Western representative, and so to say, under the order of its chiefs. It was instituted to save the Hindus from exoteric idolatries, Brahmanism, and Christian missionaries." Well, pretty strong language. The Theosophical Society was, in fact, so impressed that they changed their name. The Theosophical Society, for about 4 years, was known as the Theosophical Society of the Arya Samaj. They changed the name, in fact, when they were still in New York, before H.P. Blavatsky and Colonel Olcott, the key founders of the Theosophical Society, even left for India. Unfortunately, it was a temporary liaison. They soon parted ways. Remember, if anyone remembers anything of the history of the early Theosophists in India, HPB and Olcott both became Buddhists. And Olcott gave speeches to other religious groups besides the Hindus, urging them to study their own religious past and their own teachings. Because the Theosophical Society was, and it was intended to be, entirely non-sectarian. And unfortunately, the noble Saraswati had other ideas and felt that he should be the interpreter of the Vedas. While his ideas included things like abolishing the caste system, ending child marriage, stopping the horrible practice of widow burning, allowing widows to remarry. He favored universal education, women's rights, and freedom from Great Britain. Next slide, please. His slogan, "Back to the Vedas," was really the key to what he had wanted to have happen in India. And so while he preached his ideas to an increasingly enthusiastic Hindu crowd, population, it didn't do anything for uniting all of the various religious groups of India. Let's go to the next slide. Sarah, the Theosophists and the Arya Samaj ended their formal allegiance, their formal association in 1882. And the following year, the Swami was assassinated. But you can see that his ideas seem to be more universal than perhaps we give him credit for from the Theosophist perspective of the day. He wrote, "There are undoubtedly many learned men among the followers of every religion. They should free themselves from prejudice, accept the universal truths, that is, those truths that are to be found alike in all religions and are of universal application. Reject all things in which the various religions differ and treat each other lovingly. It will be greatly to the advantage of the world." Next slide, please. In fact, Colonel Alcott still thought quite highly of Dayananda Saraswati. He said, "A man of spirit upon his death had passed away from India. Pandit Dayananda Saraswati is gone, the irrepressible, energetic reformer whose mighty voice and passionate eloquence for the last few years raised thousands of people in India from lethargic indifference and stupor into active patriotism is no more." Next slide. Part of Saraswati's appeal was for self-rule for India. And of course, this wasn't to happen for at least a couple of more generations. But he was very much, in the best sense of the word, a revolutionary. The problem is, going back to the idea of dependence, independence, and interdependence. When the bums are gone and the revolution is successful, there are still social, economic, and political problems. And I think the Swami was quite well aware of that dilemma, that difficulty. Let's go to the next slide. His idea of India for Indians took well into the 20th century to come to become a reality. And it was only when Mohandas Gandhi, really in the 20th century, took up the phrase Swaraj, and particularly the term Hind Swaraj, that is independence and self-rule for India, that it really it got to the point where it could become a reality. Let's go on one more slide, please. Gandhi's understanding of Swaraj took a while to mature, but eventually he wrote, "In effect, it means this: we want English rule without the Englishman. You want the tiger's nature, but not the tiger. That is to say, you would make India English. And when it becomes English, it will not be called Hindustan, but Englistan. This is not the Swaraj that I want." So that was kind of actually an intermediate step for him. Gandhi was just a boy when the Arya Samaj was formed. And while he came to champion the idea, it took a while, I think, for his ideas to mature, first in his own mind and later as he expressed them. Gandhi had actually met Blavatsky in London as a young man, about 20. About 1889, he later joined the Blavatsky Lodge of the Theosophical Society in the year just before her death. When he passed his legal bar exams, he returned to India. And I think an entire topic could be developed and presented with value on the influence of theosophy and Gandhi, the role of theosophy in Indian independence, and Unfortunately, all of that's beyond the scope of this talk. Um, Eventually, though, Gandhi realized the role played by self-discovery, self-reliance, self-restraint, purification, and human development, and the importance of service to others. Let's go on another slide. He later wrote, "It is Swaraj when we learn to rule ourselves. It is therefore in the palm of our hands. But such Swaraj has to be experienced by each one for himself. One drowning man will never save another." So to Gandhi, Swaraj implied a trust in human beings. It was his hope, it was never fully realized, but that the idea of Swaraj, along with nonviolence and the force of truth, would transform society from the ground up. It could not just be freedom from British rule. Replacing the British with a centralized Indian government was not what he had in mind, but he really came to understand that self-government, self-assessment, self-purification were really essential to the nation as well as to the individual. But he also realized that good government was, no matter how good it was in the political or outer realm, could never be a substitute for self-government. Next slide. He had a really deep and I think very philosophical idea of what civilization represents. He says civilization is that mode of conduct which points out to man the path of duty. Performance of duty and observance of morality are convertible terms. To observe morality is to attain mastery over our mind and our passions. So doing, we know ourselves. Now here in this image, we have a picture of Gandhi spinning thread, spinning cloth, was one of the things that he had hoped Indians would do, not as just an exercise, but a practical way for them to become independent of the trade and economic weight of an occupying country that had been there for 250 years. Below, the bottom part of the picture is a photograph from the 1938, I believe, Salt March, where Gandhi and thousands of others marched long distances to gather salt at the ocean as a way to demonstrate their independence from Britain. But again, it's back to more than just, his idea was more than just freedom from rule. The legacy of Gandhi is really quite remarkable. And yet, if he were present today, he would probably regard it as a failure. While modern India is the world's largest democracy, it still has a centralized government, and a lot of wealth is at the very top of society. And while the middle class is huge and growing, there still is grinding poverty in the nation of his birth. Next slide. Oh, I missed something here. I had a quote from Blavatsky. There it comes.
It comes.
There we are. Blavatsky, in her Key to Theosophy, explains really well the dilemma of human action when we're confronted with difficulties. So the political reforms that some thought Swaraj would mean, whoops, we lost it. I'm losing it on my screen. I'm not sure where we're losing it on everyone's screen or not. We went back. She writes, to seek to achieve political reforms before we've effected a reform in human nature is like putting old wine in new bottles. make men feel and recognize in their innermost hearts what is their real, true duty to all men, and every old abuse of power, every iniquitous law in the national policy based on human social or political selfishness will disappear of itself. Well, that's quite a statement of the idea of Swaraj. Self-rule by reformed human beings is the path forward to betterment of mankind. These three trials, political, social, and individual, are all eventually and ultimately all about inner transformations. Next slide, please. So we see Swaraj as really founded in the ancient wisdom. It implies a trust and a knowledge in human nature, a belief in and trust of people, but there's also awareness of human nature because of the dual character of Manas. Human beings are at once capable of great sacrifice, tremendous spirituality, wonderful service, and also the most awful cruelty to our fellow human beings and to the other beings that share the planet with us. We're all familiar with the third fundamental proposition of Blavatsky's secret doctrine, that real growth and development requires self-induced and self-devised efforts. The individual is inevitably linked to the whole, and human beings need deeply rooted spiritual ideas to further that connection and develop the real sense of universal brotherhood upon which the idea of Swaraj is ultimately based. It is admittedly a utopian vision, but then again, so are the objects of the theosophical movement. Universal brotherhood is a fact in nature, still a difficult idea for human beings in distress, for human beings that find the expedient of immediate action more important than understanding the inner nature of life. Can we go back now to the second slide? Yeah, so the political revolt that began really before the formation of the Arya Samaj in India proved a complete failure. There was a revolution in 1857. It didn't succeed. The British East India Company had to close shop, and the British Crown took control of India. The political trial, the trial of dependency, one could say, the attempt at revolution clearly passed. Dayanand Saraswati understood that there needed to be a deeper and more substantial change, or a true revolution in Indian society, and that the community of his time needed a new basis. And his solution, of course, was to go back to the Vedas. The Theosophists hoped that all religionists and people of all faiths and of none would find common ground in that ancient wisdom, and that individual self-rule, true Swaraj, would be the result of a real growth of development of the inner nature of human beings. if there are questions, if there are comments, I'd be happy to address any and all.
I was wondering, is the fact that India have a caste system made it difficult to put people together, because actually they were not all that united because of all these different tradition and customs, no? What do you think?
Oh, yes, absolutely. India was and still is a very stratified society. The caste system, although formally done away with, still in effect, is there in effect in many ways. But in the 19th century, society was fractured in two ways. It was fractured vertically, that is the caste system itself, where you have the rulers and the landowners, the Brahmins and Kshatriyas, largely governing society. And then you have the differences between Hindus and Muslims, Christians and other groups, Jains and Parsis. And so all of those groups had their own, their own history in India. And in fact, when India finally achieved independence from Great Britain, it was divided in two, in fact, in three, with Pakistan being created for the Muslims and India for the Hindus. And it was a very tumultuous and difficult time in 1947 when they achieved political independence. But the trial of independence, the social and community basis for cooperation is still not entirely achieved, but a great deal has been.
So why is it so difficult for people to understand self-governing and to self-rule? And why do they lean so heavy on external forms?
Wow, great question. Partly it has to do with the nature of our cycle. We're in a, one could say, a very materialistic cycle, so we judge things from the outside. We also have long centuries of imposed authority. We have generations upon generations used to being told how to think and what to think. And so what we call individualism is very often based on an exaggerated selfishness. And that, of course, comes from our dual nature. It comes from the fact that we have both the godlike and the demoniacal qualities within ourselves. So it's a very complex question. It's a very difficult question. And every social, political, ethical, and religious reformer in history has tried their best to overcome those kinds of divisions. And I guess the best we could say is that human beings are works in progress. Would you like to add something to that?
Well, I was thinking, Tolstoy wrote a book called The Kingdom of Heaven is Within You. And in there, he shows very clearly how we create all these systems to protect ourselves from our selfishness and our lower nature. We create laws and courts and police systems and armies and political systems, social systems. All of them are designed to protect us from our own lower nature. And he says that they will all fail. All of them will fail. That the only way is, as what's pointed out with Swaraj, which is self-governing. And Tolstoy said that. And then there was the Indian poet Tagore. He also, in his poetry, pointed to that. So it seems that all these great thinkers have to come again and again and say the same thing over and over again.
Yes, indeed. Human beings seem to need repetition. In her Key to Theosophy, Blavatsky uses an interesting word. She says, in education and educating ourselves and others, we need to inculcate ethics. And to inculcate means to instill by repeated statement and action and example of a desired kind of behavior and thought. So inculcating ethics takes time. It seems to have to take place slowly, at least in individuals and certainly in society as a whole. It doesn't seem to come readily, but it is something that can happen because human beings have that, frankly, that godlike capability within ourselves. And so it takes lifetimes for that to, that lesson really to sink in, apparently, because we often repeat the same mistakes and we ignore our own history.
Pythagoras said in that line of thoughts, educate the child and then you don't have to punish the man.
That's a great thought. Yes. There's always the next generation that can be educated. We have to know something about how to do that ourselves, but perhaps that's part of the process of learning.
Another favorite one is by Edmund Holmes. He wrote, "What is and what might be." And he said, when we deny people their higher nature, we leave them at the mercy of their lower.
Yeah, well said. Well said. Yeah, that's every reformer, every ethical thinker, I think, has come to somewhat similar conclusions about human nature and about society. The shortcuts just don't seem to work. The revolutions work temporarily, and then they have to be re-implemented, and in fact, often are overthrown, and then you're back to where you were before. Anything that happens in the outer world has to have an inner impetus before it really makes sense. But perhaps it is encouraging that the ideas that one generation might consider to be impossible or fanciful sometimes become the watchwords and accepted by future generations. So we can only hope that ideas like Swaraj, self-rule, the self-governed sage, as Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, and those self-induced and self-devised efforts will eventually create a new and better society. And Blavatsky says it well, the self of one is the self of all. And that's a fundamental principle in nature. And it's a fundamental idea about our own nature. Jonathan, I see you up there.
Oh, me?
You're the only person that I see on the screen here. Go ahead.
Okay, I've got a question that you still have on the slide here about self-induced and self-devised efforts. And it's interesting you put that under interdependence, because sometimes if a person first sees self-induced and self-devised efforts, at first glance, that's like independence, right?
Yes.
You have it under interdependence. I mean, you did an explanation on that. I was wondering if you could kind of go a little further with that. And also, maybe I got a second question, is do you think there's any special trials that kind of inherently come out when a person starts to be able to think for themselves?
Let's take that one first. Yeah, there certainly is. There's always the old habits that get in the way and the old ways of thinking. So, but that, I think really that leads to my thoughts about that idea of self-rule being and interdependence having to do with self-induced and self-devised efforts, because it really comes down to the definition of self.
Oh,
Do we mean myself personally, or do we mean the larger whole? And if we kind of equate those two, that there really is no distinction between I and you, between me and thee, then that larger self becomes the basis for true self-knowledge, for true understanding. And so the efforts that we put forth are not just for ourselves, they're for the greater whole. So there really are two sides of the same effort, I would think.
so would one's old definition of self become in conflict or create trials for this transition into the new concept of self?
Always. Yeah. There is always a Socrates called it a birth process. He was the philosophical midwife. He helped people understand what they were saying by asking them questions. And so there is always that conflict between our old ideas and our old assumptions and what's being born in ourselves as we realize that the old ideas may not be as sufficient as we had once hoped. So that process of questioning is certainly part of that self-effort that's necessary. And it's part of our natural growth. If we weren't essentially one, that the self of one is the self of all, if that weren't essentially true, then this entire process would be impossible.
Do you mind if I read you some statistics that address Jonathan's question and then have your feedback? It says roughly 12% of college students report the occurrence of suicide ideation during their first 4 years of college, with 2.6% reporting persistent suicide ideation. And then also, each year, approximately 24,000 college students attempt suicide, while 1,100 students succeed in their attempt, making suicide the second leading cause of death among US college students.
So is that a question?
Horrifying.
Yes, if you have any comments on that in regards to, Jonathan, you had asked if there's any inherent challenges that we face in this process.
Okay. What do you think, Wes?
It really, there's several things that come to mind. One could be, these are karmic tendencies from past lives. They're not, ideas that just occur to people in this life. Secondly, it would seem to be kind of, in a way, kind of an indictment about our fundamental assumptions about human beings and how we educate ourselves or fail to educate ourselves. If we're not somehow inculcating the ethics and the idea of service, then the first challenge that we meet may be that of depression. And that would seem to be what those statistics would indicate, that young college kids who have their entire lives ahead of them are depressed about the prospects and about the meaning of their lives. It would seem that lack of meaning is the real, or one of the real tragedies of our age, in that we teach a one life doctrine to largely either a materialistic or a religious viewpoint, and we don't show enough of a clear path that involves individuals with service and meaningful ideas and meaningful work. It would seem that those kinds of that kind of depression would be really deeply rooted in our sense of self. And I don't know if there's a quick fix or an obvious answer to that kind of to those statistics, but it would seem that whatever it is we're doing as a society, as a civilization, is not working as well as it should. Maybe the fact that the other 88% of college students don't report that as a suicide as a thought should give us pause and try to examine why it is that they don't feel that way.
Well, it's interesting when we look at people who had suicidal thoughts but yet overcame them. The one thing that they all have in common is that they discovered something of the higher nature, that they realized that they weren't the body they lived in. They weren't the personality or the feelings or the thoughts. And then they asked the question, well, who am I then? Who is this I that is watching? Who is this I that is experiencing? And when they discovered that part of themselves, they were able to lift themselves out of the despair of the lower nature, which is interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a good point, Laura. I'm also reminded of the works by Viktor Frankl. I know the title of the one book he wrote after having been a prisoner during World War II, from death camp to existentialism, and I think it was another title of the work as well. But what he said was that the fellow prisoners that were around him, the ones that survived, were those that survived because of a purpose. They either had a cause or an individual or something that was beyond themselves, wider than their own difficulties, that allowed them gave them the strength to survive and to make it through the most horrible and debilitating and degrading conditions that one could imagine. So a sense of purpose and a sense of an understanding of service would seem to go along with what you're talking about there.
And also our entertainment industry, obviously, is a lot to blame in a sense, because, as you know, this is like a propaganda, and being in the business for so many years, I mean, in the 30s and the 40s, the advertisement, they were called product placement. So people would have a problem and immediately have a drink or have a cigarette. And they promote that very heavily, even back then. We know that a lot of teen suicide are connected also to abuse of drugs and alcohol and so on. And I think that it's increasing. And I just heard from the Japanese news that is since the pandemic, the suicide rates have doubled in many countries. And I know United States is one of them. So it's always been a problem, but I think with the pandemic, as you mentioned before, people have no purpose, and they have glamorized also suicide because a lot of celebrities have committed suicide in the past. So I think that the industry is not helping the situation, and people just feel very empty.
That's a good point, Maluka. The arts have often, played to the least common denominator, and if that becomes the most commonly found, it's difficult to find alternatives sometimes. But those things are out there. It's a matter of making them available to people. And it was observed years ago that sometimes the very best of human beings are involved in the salvage professions. That is, those that help with the downtrodden and the poorest and the most desperate. And that's sometimes where you find the Mother Teresa's and the Father Damien's and the real servants of humanity. And those are not always taught as the ideal for human beings. And maybe we need to find better ways to hold up those kinds of individuals as examples and as models, and to show a clear path of service, rather than what's often depicted, which is pure selfishness and greed of all kinds.
Do you think you can hit stop share? That way we can, there we go.
Oh, there we are. Okay.
Hello, everybody.
There you
Well,
go ahead, Monica.
Monica, go for it.
Yes, I just wanted to make one small comment about the entertainment industry. And that is that I believe that the exact same thing that society at large suffers from, which is the absence of these powerful sacred truths, and the belief in basically nothing beyond materialism, has an intensified focus on the personality in the entertainment industry. And this is the same problem overall, but there is a trap, I think, that is stronger in the industry, because there is such an stardom seems to be a phenomenon that has not always been there, and defining it is basically without the idea of the individual connected to his own star and serving humanity from that divine impulse. So it's a bit of danged if you do, danged if you don't situation that entertainers find themselves in. And then there's the quick fix of feeling better immediately through the use of drugs and alcohol. So I just wanted to offer that idea that, once again, it's the disconnect from these sacred truths, but specifically in the industry, the individual soul connected to his star. So.
Point. Thank you.
Yeah, Monica, if I could just elaborate a little bit on that, or embroider a little bit on that. It's really ironic, like in the old Hollywood, these in quote personality stars were nothing more than servants or enslaved to the studio system. They were commodities. They weren't people. They were absolutely commodities to be bought, sold, lent out, as to the whim of whoever the particular studio head was at that time. But we know all this, right?
Well, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. And what I mean by that is there are plenty of remarkably successful stars who could not develop in the way that they did and give to humanity in the way that they did without somehow being in touch with and recognizing their star in the cosmos. And so however and in whatever way you could deliver that to the masses was the secular issue that you had to deal with. Some got lost in it, some did not. But that ability to go from a person who has some talent to a recognition of their soul, to a recognition of their star and its dharma, I can't help but think that there were plenty who understood what it was that they're giving. So it's not a total loss.
But that indicates a knowledge of Swaraj that comes from within.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, the interesting thing about this cycle, in theosophy in the East, it's known as the Kali Yuga. You know, it's everything is upside down and things are mixed up. And so you have remarkable talent and good use of the arts, and you also have a very poor and very selfish use of otherwise, you know, useful and potentially useful personalities or tools or whatever, however we want to describe it. Human beings have amazing capabilities, and there have been in the arts, and they're always continue.
Hey, Wes, you're breaking up so bad that I think I should
remarkable creations. Not every, you know, every film is a gem, and not every novel or every essay is worthy of being reprinted. But there's always something useful being done.
Hey, Wes.
Unfortunately, the really well, the really popular things are often those that where people are following the least common denominator. Yeah, I hear that too. I hear that with you too.
So thank you all very, very much for coming, and I hope you all have a really good week. So, and Wes, above all, thank you so much for this very nourishing current of thought that you've given us.